Serdecznie witam nasze kameralne grono.
I'd like to greet our small group. I'm aware that Christmas is coming, so it might be harder to decide to leave your home. But I'd like to thank you for coming to this meeting, which I think will be very interesting. Our guests are Antonia Alampi, co-director in Savvy Contemporary in Berlin, who also has curated many important projects which she will discuss with us during a conversation with Joanna Warsza, our second guest. Right now, artistic director of the Public Art Munich Festival 2018. As you might remember, Joanna also co-curated the Berlin Biennale, the 7th one, together with Artur Żmijewski, and she also curated many other initiatives and publications, including the Georgia Pavilion in Venice Biennale, Gothenburg Biennale, or the public program Manifesta 10. We are happy that she is with us today, that both of us are with us today. And Joanna is also introduced to you as the curator of Janek Simon exhibition that will be open at the end of February in the Ujazdowski castle. This debate of today is part of a series of debates called Curating Institutions that we decided not to translate into Polish. We are interested in theories and practices of places, institutions that work with contemporary art all over the world, with, simply speaking, a question that they pose to themselves and that is in the background of their practices of what is critical art nowadays in today's conditions, in the ever-changing social-political reality. I'm sure that the term has changed its meaning comparing with what was 5 or 10 years ago, and how can those institutions in a critical way work with this concept. So we are getting to know different kinds of practices, and the meeting today will be most of all dedicated to Savvy Contemporary in Berlin, co-managed by Alampi, but not only. So we would like Joanna to present our guest right now. Thank you. So let me stand up. Thank you for the invitation to manage to moderate this meeting. As you know, in Berlin there are around 1,000 places, so you don't never know where to go. In Warsaw, you can trust, for example, Center for Contemporary Art, on Museum of Modern Art. There are kind of couple of places that give you good content. In Berlin, it's completely different, so you have to somehow curate your own time to know where to go. But there are such places like Savvy where you can go without checking, because it always will be good, and it's one of the most important places that watches closely what's going on and sheds light on the most important debates of our times. Antonia Alampi, together with other people, there are 3 directors, Bonaventura Nikung, whom we met here 5 years ago. Antonia and then Elena Aguido are the 3 curators of that institution, but that's the only one of many places where Antonia works. in small institutions with great ambitions. So it's a different scale. Sometimes big institutions lack ambition, but in this case, these are small institutions with big ambitions. So she, apart from Savi, works with Iliana Fokidi from Athens, who's also director of small play State of Concepts in Athens, and together they have a long-term project, Future Climates, within which they have created self-created parallel to Documenta and critique of Documenta in Athens. And between 2012 and 2015, she co-directed the Beirut space in Cairo, calling it a place with expiry date, a place that will finish, but that was the concept of the place that it would end. So what's important in Antonia's work, it's not only about art, of course art is the first priority, but also care, solidarity, feminism. So now I give Antonia the floor to speak to us, give us a presentation. Technical information, there is simultaneous interpreting, so you can grab your headphones from the back of the room.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. I didn't really understand anything, but it looked really nice and you were smiling, so it sounded like a really warm introduction. Thank you for that. And yeah, I want to thank you for inviting me here, Małgorzata, for also keeping on with a conversation that I feel has started already a few years ago. For Joanna, also Saran, for taking great care of me, and of course for Joanna for accepting to be a respondent. So when I was invited to speak, you know, with something that I felt was maybe also coming in the aftermath of the conversations that we started when I met Małgorzata in Qatar. This was 2014, and it was in the context of a big and gigantic conference organized by SIMAM, that is the Association of Museums of Modern and Contemporary Art, and we met also with a quite passionate and at times rageful discussion about how to frame the idea of building institutions in certain geographical locations, and how certain geographical locations often tend to be reduced or summarized or synthesized in, through very few characteristics. But I'll go into this a bit more later on. So basically, I mean, the idea is to divide the talk through 3 different examples, which I felt could build on a narrative that would try to respond to this idea of how to create institutions critically, and essentially looking at the work that I've done with 3 different organizations that I've worked with, or that I still work with, that are extremely visionary and in a sense very experimental, but also extremely precarious, for many different reasons, but especially from an economic perspective and from a perspective of scale, and try to wave a narrative through 3 specific projects that are curated there. One is titled Geographies of Imagination, and it's a show that I just recently curated at Savi Contemporary and just closed with, and I curated together with Bonaventure Ndikung, and it was trying to look into curatorial methods of disordering and the problems inherent in certain geographical specificationisms that certain cultural institutions tend to do. The second is titled The Imaginary School Program, and this was a project that I did when I used to live in Cairo and was a curator of something that I think was introduced, which was an institution called Beirut in Cairo. And it was basically an 8-month educational program that I developed together with Jens Meyer-Rote, Sarah Rifki, and Lotta Schäfer, which was a program conceived to address radical institution building and how to engage and hone on to the oral knowledge that radicality often implies as a form of existence, because that knowledge is simply too dangerous to write down and archive anywhere. And finally, the last project is the School of Redistribution, which is something that I developed through the platform that she introduced, which is called Future Climates, within the program of State of Concept in Athens, through which I will share concerns about the economic conditions that shape and determine the work of cultural organizations, and in a way also give form to what we can say and how we actually say it. I wanted to start by reading a short poem, because I want to start by just sharing some notes on imagination. Imagination, who can sing Thai force, or who describe the swiftness of Thai course, soaring through the air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering god. We on Thai pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star, the mental optics rove, measure the skies and range the realms above. There, in one view, we grasp the mighty whole, or with new worlds, amaze the unbounded soul. This is a poem by Phyllis Whiteley. Now, around the second half of the 18th century, so 1700s, Phyllis Whiteley, who's the first published African-American female poet and a former slave, wrote this poem, this is just a fragment of it, titled On Imagination. Now, here imagination stands as a possible space for the slave's emancipation, one that is conceivable through the mind, while the body keeps being trapped in the materiality of existence. Imagination, in this sense, can be understood as a space of resistance, one that allows for the oppressed to construct a being of and in dignity. A space that is less threatening and a possibility of harboring an idea of freedom, so in a sense a space for protection for oneself or for one's community. Imagination in this sense drove the arduous journeys of generations of migrants across the sea, across the deserts. It is a cognitive space that inspires taking great risks. Risks that can be at times worth death even. A strong courage lies in following the will of imagination, one that is not blind but is determined. One that stands behind achieving radical changes of existential paradigms, for example, considered unacceptable. All that is worth risking everything you have for. And of course, imagination, as being people who work in cultural organizations, I think is something that we always need to kind of remember. Imagination, however, and here I will go now to the reference of the title of the exhibition, imagination did, and keeps also playing a completely different role. So the title actually chosen for the exhibition, which I repeat is Geographies of Imagination, is actually a direct reference to academic and anthropologist Michel Ralph Trouillot's writings on the issue of false representations, of imaginary geographies essential to the West in the construction of its narrative empires. So a false representation used to reorganize meaning, used to legitimize its supremacy. So these attempts of false representations of imaginary geographies run dialectically through much of the epistemological literature of the last 200 years and stand as the foundation of academic and museological disciplines, such as, for instance, anthropology. In these narratives, so in these imaginary constructions of the other, the white male is often the subject, while other histories and identities are actually defined around the needs, the lifestyle, and the history of the subject. The other, in a certain white imagination, is the savage, and this is what Trouillot writes about. A savage that lies between heavenly and hellish extremes, an imaginary other that the West needed to legitimize its supremacy, a supremacy that is based on reason and justice, precisely because the other is utopia or barbarism, one that justifies exploitation of bodies, of land, of labor, of environment, and dehumanization, offering to a community constructed on a false sense of whiteness the illusion of superiority. Bell Hooks, who's a very important writer, feminist writer for me, in an essay from 1992 titled Representing Whiteness in the Black Imagination, starts her argument by asserting that barely any black anthropologists or ethnographers have ever taken the study of whiteness as their focus. At the opposite end, for instance, to how many white academics, theoreticians, or cultural producers have instead engaged with the study of blackness. However, she goes on, knowledge and observations about whiteness have always existed, of course, but passed through means mostly pertaining to oral tradition. This is because the white other, of course, always needed to be well known in order to survive in a white supremacist society, to survive centuries of white domination. In times of slavery, in times of legal segregation, whiteness was connected to the mysterious, to the strange, and above all, to the terrible. The white other was, and as she writes, still is, an imaginary figure of thought made of the bricks and steel structures of centuries of racism, of exploitation, and of enslavement. It is deeply connected to terror. The white other is a terrorist because she or he is terrorizing. It embodies surveillance. It is looking in order to control. In The Origin of Others, which is yet another very important reference for me, Toni Morrison takes the reader through the genealogy of the construction of the other, the psychological, cultural, and political work behind the act of othering. Now, with the act of othering, I mean constructing differences that sustain subalternity, slavery, and exploitation while divorcing from moral judgment. She describes the need to find an outsider to define oneself and to preserve one's own privileges, of the human impulse since time immemorial to define those not in our clan or in our community as the enemy. The enemy is defined by a perceived difference, and this difference is, of course, not just race. It can be gender, class, wealth, or else. It is, in the end, this impulse, as she writes, is about power and the necessity to control. As Cherry Moraga argues in a beautiful article called La Guerra, many bio-minorities, and bio-minority is actually a recent coinage by Arjuna Padurai, referring to the kind of minorities I'm trying to talk about here, so many bio-minorities have been caged in an oppressive imaginary that has ultimately also been internalized by the oppressed. But more importantly, as she goes on, it is not really a difference that the oppressor fears so much as similarity. They fear the loss of their own privilege. They fear the desires of others for what they themselves fallaciously possess. Essentially, they fear sameness. What Arjuna Padurai asked during this talk was, what mimetic desire does the figure of the oppressed allow the oppressor to resolve by its victimhood? The other, writes Ta-Nehisi, he quotes in his introduction, actually, to Morrison's book, exists beyond the border of the great belonging. Something that contributed to producing the sense of anxiety that brought the white and patriarchal supremacist people of the far rights to politically emerge again in recent elections in the US, and as in many European countries, and Italy, I'm Italian, is definitely one of them. I don't know what the situation in Poland is, would be interesting to talk about it later, because I get information here and there. I would like to bring in, and this kind of more theoretical introduction will finish soon, so don't get too bored yet. There's another very interesting theorist that I would like to bring in. His name is Kwame Anthony Appiah. He wrote a text that is called Race in the Modern World, the Problem of the Color Line. Now, in this text, he identifies different phases in processes of othering, and particularly in the understanding of race. So if issues of racism could already be witnessed from ancient Egypt to Greece, or what he says, differences based on what he calls peoplehood, what we actually understand as race in the modern world has its beginning only in the 19th century, so at the beginning of the 1800s, actually with the understanding of race as a biological fact, which coincides actually with the birth of biology as a scientific discipline. This conception in this particular historical period actually meets the making of nations and the raising of nationalism, contributing to the construction of the notion of people biologically belonging to precise geographical locations. Hence, a body can be attached to geography. A body is constituted by and through the history of the movement and the migration of people. A body is politically important because essentially inherited differences come along with specific psychological, moral, and intellectual traits. Now, I want to bring you in an interesting reference that essentially connects back to my own body as a South Italian, actually as a Calabrian woman, that I think also clarifies a bit more the discussion on race and territorial belonging that goes way further than issues or divisions that are only based on skin color. So in 1872, Cesare Lombroso is his name, who's a controversial figure of Italian history. He's a criminologist and paraphysician. Imagine that this is the moment in which criminology as a kind of parascientific discipline is actually born and developed. He's the founder of what is called the Italian School of Positivist Criminology, published one of his most famous books, which is called L'uomo delinquente, which literally translates in the criminal man. Now, I could summarize Lombroso's position as an evolutionary theory based on the belief that criminal behaviors are, for the most part, an inherited and congenital trait, traceable via physical and congenital defects, such as, for instance, a specific conformation of the head, the brain, and some body parts, but also that specific types of people belong to specific geographies. Now, in L'uomo delinquente, he goes, and I quote, "It is in the African and Oriental roots of the South Italian man that we need to attribute the cause for the high frequency of murders in regions like Calabria, Sicily, or Sardinia, which are essentially 3 regions of southern Italy. And it is actually the skull of a Calabrian man, which is the region I come from, famous Giuseppe Villela, that Lombroso will use as his archetype. And actually this skull is still in Turin in the museum dedicated to Lombroso. Now, Alfredo Riceforo, who will be one of his fellows, will continue a few years later on this line, stating essentially that Italy is composed of 2 parts, and these 2 parts are constituted of 2 different descents, quite dissimilar to each other, or rather bearing different physical traits, hence also psychological characteristics that come along with those body conformations. Now, one of those races populates the north, and one of those races populates the south and the islands. Now, these are years in which, just like Southern Italian Antonio Gramsci will come from Sardinia, maybe he's one of the most famous Italian thinkers, you might know him. This is years in which he himself will be observing later, now we're talking about the 1900s, that between the working class of the north of the country, the prevailing idea was that the south was the problem hindering the country's development, and that this problem was caused by natural destiny. So basically by the human underdevelopment of the southern man. Gramsci writes, quote, "The southern people are considered a biologically inferior species, semi-barbarians or total barbarians by natural destiny." End of quote. So he mentions this in an unfinished essay from 1926, which is called Alcuni temi della questione meridionale, which translates in some topics on the southern issue, in which he will basically address the ideas that will continue to develop in his more famous letters from the prison. So he essentially was convinced that one of the biggest challenges towards the progress of civic Italian development was to overcome anti-Southern prejudices. And essentially the racism spread by the intellectual bourgeoisie, mostly in the north, concerning the fact that the South and its population represented the main problem acting against the development of the country. So one of the core issues he identifies here was one of representation. The false and entirely imaginary picture that the economic and political elite was creating to attract consensus from the mass of the northern working class and inspire and produce the illusion of superiority. So here the issue of representation is, again, which is, I think, a very important issue considering the role that cultural institutions play, is crucial, and it's politically crucial. It's not just culturally crucial. And this is because essentially the importance doesn't lie in defining ethno-racial groups or differences, but in understanding the social and cultural processes, the governmental and institutional laws and regulations, the neoliberal agendas that are attached to the making of them. Othering and the comfort of othering is not about difference, but it's about power. The subalternity that derives from othering acts is the effect of the exploitation of difference through many different forms. So to recapitulate, we've discussed how the drawing of boundaries and the making of nations becomes essentially attached to notions of essentially homogeneous ethnic groups populating them, but also how exploitation, expropriation, and segregation are actually legitimized precisely through the imaginary construction of the other as naturally inferior. But also how these notions are developed under the auspices of new parascientific disciplines that, again, justify them under the name of science. To quote Appiah again, if nationalism was the view that natural social groups should come together to form states, then the ideal form of nationalism at this point would bring together people of a single race. And now we'll finally delve into the exhibition more concretely. So an important point of departure for us was nationalism in a say, or geography and cartography, essentially used as instruments of power. The making of places, the making of nations, the making of communities. So tools that are not inherently harmful, but they can become harmful depending on what purposes, you know, that they're used for. And this is why the exhibition actually began with a timeline that you can see here, in which, let's say, in an inevitable act of synthesis, we kind of flew over the timeline was not about the history of maps or of mapping or geography as a discipline, but let's say what we wanted to do was trying to create a sort of cartographic history that would zoom in particularly important for us historical periods that are also often overlooked or not, or more than overlooked, I would say, have been erased from history. It's something malevolent and programmatic. It's not just forgetting. So we started our journey with the lines that were drawn to define and divide actually the West from the East. Through a new global spatial order that initiated actually with the discovery of the New World. So particularly we pointed our fingers to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is one of the core ones in which this first line, you know, with the new, particularly with the role of Spain and Portugal, was actually drawn. Now, this was a convenient starting point for us if we agree that since the end of the 15th century, and up until actually the 20th, Christian and the becoming capitalist Europe in this global order represented the standard, the center, the focal norm, and the guiding and enlightening civilization. One that understood the New World, the Americas, not as an enemy to trade with, or someone, or a space or a place to trade with, but as a free space to conquer. Within this concept of geography, some Europowers adopted what Carl Schmitt defined as global linear thinking. Now, with global linear thinking, he means a relatively superficial understanding of space based on the equation of land and sea surfaces drawn as soon as European powers had set their eyes on the Americas, in which you literally like just draw lines to divide space. Now, we could even trace back the origins of Europe's approach in exploiting labor, land, and resources predominantly outside of its borders precisely to these lines, made possible by the fact that there were different moral, legal, and political values that would change and shift depending on which side of these lines you would find yourself in. And that's actually where the expression beyond the line in international law comes from. So it was with this new spatial order that, based on states, on division in nations, that a new and relevant spatial thinking developed in the Western, what we've coined MP sphere. And here we're suggesting this new coinage to express the violent mix of geographical spheres with empires, because of course also the notion of the West or of Europe is a floating signifier, right? It's not that, obviously it's a very generic and constantly shifting definition that we're using for the sake of the argument. Sorry, I'm thinking how to make things maybe slightly easier. Basically, I mean, the core focus that we had in this map making or in this cartographic timeline was actually a relationship, I would say, between Africa and Europe particularly, and the Americas as well, but more, let's say, Africa and Europe. And hence also how, as some writers have written about, the Africa was kind of invented in this kind of new spatial global order, so to speak. So what we wanted to look is really how European cartography turned Africa into a continent. And at this point that it was important to draw a historical cartographic line basically from the Berlin Conference, which here we're talking about 1884, 1885, through the notion of Eurafrica, which instead is actually a notion that came up much later and that was at the core also of the formation of the European Union actually. So this definition will be quite central in the 1950s for in the Conference of Rome, which basically gave birth to the kind of contemporary notion of European Union, which was basically a way to integrate the African colonies in a federal European project that would constitute a sort of third power together with Asia and Americas, and also would keep peace on the continent precisely by this kind of like peaceful division of the resources. So what we decided to start in introducing the exhibition is actually a timeline that is also hand-drawn on one side of the entrance of the corridor, so that also the fact that this is something that the time and the dates and the story that we're narrating is particularly is handmade. You know, it's not an objective truth that we were imposing on the audience. We wanted to do something as obviously hand-drawn as this to just highlight how subjective actually the writing of such a history is, you know, no matter who the writer is, so to speak. And for us, it was almost a cartographic reflection that could bear witness to the 20th century reclamations and divisions of cartographic space via anti-colonial independence movements and through the multiplication of international, national, and intranational borders and the making of new alliances. Concurrently, of course, we found ourselves in the 21st century with varied ideation on technologies and practices rooted in cartographic scarification. And these technologies that go from artificial intelligence to geographic information system software were called upon and activated precisely for their history. Our own timeline then faced a series of panels. This is just one of them. We had over 16 that were developed by Chimurenga, which is a collective and a publication that exists in South Africa but operates throughout the continent, and was mostly related to one issue that we found particularly interesting from March 2015, which was titled New Cartographies. What they did there was taking as a starting point the role of cartography as a tool of imperialism, and basically what they tried to ask with this series of panels was, what if maps were made by Africans for their own use to understand and make visible their own realities and imaginaries? How does it shift the perception we have of ourselves and how we make life on this continent? End of quote. This is a quote from the panel. For this purpose, basically, Chimurenga invited writers and artists to produce this new language in words and images. So their intervention acted as a sort of, quote, attempt to deconstruct a colonial parceling that was internalized too easily, such as Arab as North, Black as Equator, White as South, with their Easts and Wests. So complicating these ways that are this way too easy categories. The corridor culminated with a video that you see here by an artist called Alla Binto Diallo, whose work is titled Maps, in which the rhythm of hands clapping punctuates a flow of images featuring materials from the artist's own archive of photographs between Senegal and Canada, a sequence of school maps and stereotypical images of both countries. But juxtaposing these images, Maps offers a sort of visual critique of the image of the world's patriarchy and racial capitalism have produced in order to control and oppress, and the failure of education to give us access to a multiplicity of histories. So basically the video goes through somehow her whole process of education via also you know, textbooks, maps, etc. This is a work by Anna Binta Diallo that is called Borders, and let's say the first space of the exhibition was trying to create a sort of domesticity as a space of cultural conditioning. So already this space of the home or of the domestic sphere as a space of cultural conditioning. Here Lindahl presented a work titled Borders, where she was trying to look, basically you had 4 different videos that were shown simultaneously on televisions on an IKEA shelf that she understood as a kind of symbol of home, in this case in Iceland. And the videos relate to nature and culture's invasion of the private sphere of the home. It is a piece about a search for a possible Icelandic identity through nature, science, and tradition, always with a deep view of the self in those physical or imaginary spaces. I'll move on directly to the second. It's too much, I think, to go work by work. this is the largest segment of the exhibition, in which I think we address more directly the issue of the imaginary construction of identities and how they are essentially attached to bodies, as I addressed before. One that I think might be interesting in this case is Tanya Muraskaja, who is presented a series of portraits of male Nordic faces called Estonian Race. And this was for her an attempt at understanding the modern post-Soviet state developing within a promoted and celebrated mono-ethnic concept of a nation and an understanding of the fact that there is no such thing as an Estonian race. She comes from the Ukrainian minority, actually, in Estonia. And what she was saying when we were talking was that at the beginning, you know, she always felt that there was a perceived difference about her, and that was related to language. The fact that the way she spoke obviously expressed the fact that she was from the Ukrainian part. But then she realized, because she teaches also a lot and her language is perfect, that it wasn't really about language, but it was actually about visual aspects. So basically what she did in this work, which is an ongoing series of portraits, which features, I think, over 50 now, is basically photographing males that kind of respond to definitions of Estonian race that she's been given by different scholars that she's talking to. So how would you define Estonian race today, which is apparently something that is very much discussed in, let's say, current politics, and what would these features be? And I think what I found also interesting is the technique, in the sense that all of her subjects are actually all posing exactly in the same way, wear the same things, hence any individuality is actually completely suppressed and erased in favor of only one thing that they're supposed to be performing here, which is their visual characteristic that perform Estonianness, which she also doesn't detail necessarily. Of course, in the context also of the show at Savi, this became also a very difficult context even for her to be in, because this became an almost like over-representation of like white supremacy, particularly in relationship to other works that we that were literally looking at this series of portraits, such as these pieces by Mahir Jamal, who did almost the opposite act. He basically worked with the black community in Vienna, and he asked his, actually this is mostly friends of his, to perform and act and emphasize characters that they feel they're perceived as when they walk on the street, simply by the fact of being black, such as the rapper, the criminal, etc. Plus, technically, the photographic paper is crumpled. And so actually, when you look at them, what he sort of emphasized, and I feel both works are actually emphasizing, there's nothing you can actually see through a stereotype. There's nothing left of any person. There's no reality, actually. There's no real person that you can see through, right? It's just another layer that exists instead of it. Now, in between this sort of series of also deep masculinity, because all of the subjects in both series are actually men. We had works by Oscar Murillo that were really somewhat, and literally in this case, floating between these two extremes. And the series that you see here is called Flights. And this work that you see here is actually quite central. It's called The Coming of the Europeans. And this is actually his family. Oscar Murillo works a lot about his own roots. He's Colombian, and his family migrated to England in the early 90s. His father his grandfather, actually, it's African Colombian also, so used to work in a plantation. So he works a lot into complicating also notions of identity. And in this case, it's all his family, black, with the title Coming of the Europeans. So actually wanting to be very humoristic about this sort of self-representation of Europeans as completely and entirely white. Now in this series of drawings, actually what he works on, it's an ongoing series since 2016 where he does drawings on maps actually, and always on airplanes. And the series is called Flight. So he really wants to emphasize also somehow also the bird view of privilege by being even allowed and able to see the world from airplanes, which is a completely different view that you have actually as a migrant, and of course is a completely different view and understanding of space that his father had as a migrant. And in the show we had a lot also about the whole history of his father and what it takes actually to move from Colombia to England. So it wasn't so much about what it takes to integrate once you are in England and but really what it actually takes to leave, which is probably the most difficult aspect, actually. We had then works by Rossella Biscotti. In this case, it's actually called Dead Minorities, and this is now on the floor, and the work is part of a series that basically interrelates data processing techniques, demographics, and textile manufacturing, so as to question how statistics and quantitative analysis not only represent a given reality, might also hide the cognitive basis implied in contemporary profiling methods. I realized that I'm much longer than I hoped I would be. This is a work by Sadi Chua, who's a Belgian-Moroccan artist, very interesting, who made a whole video installation that was also trying to complicate big icons also of white feminist theory. In this case, for example, there was a lot of focus on the figure of Margaret Sanger, who's actually one of the conceivers of the birth control pill in the United States, and is still kind of praised and considered an icon, praised recently by Hillary Clinton, etc. And she actually kind of unveiled or digged out a lot of more information about her and how actually the birth control pill was related in this case also to the possibility of exterminating a race. She was actually also at the forefront of the Ku Klux Klan. So actually there was a precise motivation behind behind the actually founding and research into this new form of contraception. We had various different artists I'll just fly over. This is a work, for example, by Sandra Shaffer, who's interestingly was actually the only German artist in the exhibition. The exhibition was in Berlin. And she actually made a whole work that was about the relationship that she had actually to, or let's say, how her documentary work could actually be facilitated by the fact that she essentially had a German passport. So how many spaces and accesses she would actually be granted. In this case, it was particularly in Afghanistan, and the work looks a lot into various different feminist movements actually in Afghanistan and what type of privileges she actually had through the soft politics of Goethe Institutes and through the passport that she actually bears. This is the work by Heba Amin, who basically was the research background of an incredibly interesting research that actually looks into new technocratic geographical fantasies of the 20th century. In particular, she was looking at a few projects. One is called Atlantropa, which was actually a project developed by a German engineer in the early, well, actually for a few decades, but let's say from the early 1900s up until after the Second World War, which basically wanted to merge Africa and Europe into one continent by sinking the Mediterranean Sea. You know, within a very kind of pan-European ideology, but also with the aim of, you know, resolving poverty, actually. And it's quite interesting because she goes through also why, you know, various governments decide to either approve of the project or disapprove. Nazi Germany, for example, will completely ban it, but will make a documentary out of it that then will be presented at the Venice Film Festival and will win actually the Venice Film Festival because Mussolini will want to support Hitler, and then actually the project, once the Second World War is ended, is supported again by the United States of America, and through a number of declassified CIA files, she actually also has material on why actually the CIA would support such a project, which would be to oppose communism, because they feel that this could be a key towards fighting poverty, and poverty, as in literally their words, is a way to take off the hook of the communist alliance. I'll move on to other works. This is quite interesting by an artist whose name is American artist, who did a whole work on Sandra Bland, who was an American citizen, African American, who was basically arrested on the roads in a car because she was too fast. Conversation escalates with the police officer, is arrested. Basically, something like 48 hours later, she's found dead in her prison cell. And what was particularly poignant in this case is that she passed from a moment of hyper-visibility because she had a YouTube program. She was, let's say, recording everything also on her phone. So everything, also the whole conversation with the police officer is actually online and visible until she reaches total invisibility once she's in the prison. And there's no cameras that actually have any proof or evidence on how she died and under which conditions. Now, what the artist did was also the outcome of a number of reflections that have to do with how do you talk about such violence without actually re-perpetrating it? So how can you talk about violence without showing that violence again, which I think is an ongoing discussion also in relationship to works such as Arthur Jaffa and others. And so basically what he did is creating an algorithm through which Sandra somehow has a legacy, in the sense that the algorithm will, it's basically an artificial intelligence character that is called Sandra Bland, which was actually the program that she had on YouTube, that basically interacts with the audience and gives information about the prison system, the police system in the US, and actually grows with the questions and the conversation with the audience. So it's something that will continue to grow and, in a way, continue fight the cause that Sandra herself was fighting. I'll move on because I'm way too... this actually is quite an interesting, just a last two works. This is by Ibrahim Mohamed, which is a work actually that was reflecting about also the racist legacy of many monuments still standing in public space today. So it's not just about understanding what colonial period or colonial officer they're praising, but also what type of racist meaning, no matter if you know who the person is or not, they're actually still performing. So what propaganda values in the end they keep having in public space. And so he created a counter monument to it, thinking that maybe instead of keeping them or confining them in colonial museums, maybe we should think of continuing working on them and transforming them in new images. And this was then another work that is also a book actually for children by Daniella Ortiz. That was basically, it's called The ABC of Racist Europe. And it's an art that is also basically a sort of, she uses the technique of the alphabet in which different words, images, and phenomena are scrutinized and explained through both the Eurocentric and white-centric interpretation, but also via the anti-colonial and anti-racist alternatives that are offered. Now, just to say that I feel that ultimately with this exhibition and also the public program that came along with it, what we tried to do was really building connections between the varied and conflicting uses of imagination in constructing otherness, the role of geography as a tool of power, and the ways power stands at the core also of processes of othering. So we have how processes of othering in the end are connected to forms of belonging, that we could also relate to notions of territoriality and possession. And this is a quote from Bell Hooks, which I think was very important for us when thinking about not just this exhibition, but also how we move on from it as an institution, which is really like, how can we find, now we understood as humanity, a sense of belonging that will encourage us and bring us to embrace all of the conditions of the world, even beyond the human species and towards the earth as a whole. Or how can we engage in what Angela Davis recently defined planetary belongingness? How can we stop our impulse to own, to govern, and to administrate the other? How can we undo the comfort of othering? And how can we, because we believe that understanding the multiple reasons behind processes of othering can indeed help us to undo them in an effort to change the present by putting it in a different relationship to the past. How tired are you? We're not that huge audience, you can also tell me. Because I have 2 more projects, but maybe they're too much. I'm thinking, you give me a sign when it's too long. Honestly. Yeah, we can. Like the imaginary school program and yeah, let's do that. Okay.
Not that I want to come back there.
No, it makes sense.
Dynamic.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you, Antonia. So let's, well, just one comment before going further.
Yeah.
So you spoke actually now about the exhibition content very precisely, but I think what is also very important in your work, and maybe we can go in this Beirut, is that you have a very deep sense of looking at the terms and conditions in which an institution works. So it's not only, let's say, an institution interested in decolonizing in the sense of like looking further, being more intersectional on the terms of programming. It's also how do you institute something in the team structure, And I guess it's all of us working in the institutions, it's important also to remember that many institutions, they were not created just out of the sudden. They are there because some time ago, some people mobilized. They mobilized for something, right? They had some kind of a cause. And through bureaucracy, sometimes this is, forgotten and the reality is different. So just simple question, maybe referring to Beirut or other, how to institute in the sense of like starting something, like Gerard Drowning is speaking of instituting, How to institute concepts, like intersectionality, feminism, this othering in the initiatives, art initiatives.
It's interesting that you mentioned Gerald Drowning because I feel that recently I have a lot of difficulties in bridging the relationship between theory and practice. I feel there's so many people that talk about the commons and, as you say, about feminist practices, acts of care, and, as you say, instituting differently, but often have almost no experience actually in doing it. Where I think that actually the biggest challenge is, in fact, come or emerge because I feel there is a lot of privileges that are actually in question in trying to do things differently, let's say, and a lot of emotional management also that comes along with it. I must say I come from an experience that is mostly working at the margins and working in very small institutions that were self-organized or self-instituted, as you say. So where in most cases, I came in from the very beginning also, so where, let's say, the vision of the founders was literally just taking place and taking form and was also being shaped in some sense by the presence of, the people that then ultimately become part of those beginning and initial visionary ideas.
Like Beirut, right? This is the place.
Yeah, so this is the place where I used to work from 2011 or 2012 to 2015, and it was in Cairo. And I think it's really important also in this case to start with the economic conditions that defined it. So 2012 means that this institution was founded in the sort of post-Arab uprisings period, which was a very important but also very difficult period because it was paradoxical. It was maybe the best time to be a cultural practitioner from Egypt because there was such an incredible and voracious international attention to what was happening. At the same time, it was probably also one of the most difficult times for being one. So what happened at the time is that a lot of, on the one hand, you had international museums being super interested, curators traveling to Cairo all the time, picking artists, inviting them in shows, making big Arab shows, making big revolution shows, etc. On the other hand, you had a lot of money that was literally pumped into the country from foreign bodies in order to support, new democratic institutions that would essentially reconstruct a country after decades of dictatorship. Now, the problem also with a lot of this funding that is pumped is that it's very short and very temporary, essentially. It's something that many institutions, you know, you take it and you're excited and finally you have the money to build something, but actually you kind of slowly discover that this is gonna last just as long as the, you know, situation is seductive and exotic, you know, as it is, and as soon as there's a new sort of, whatever, cynical upheaval or disgrace somewhere else, actually in most cases, those fundings are immediately turned somewhere else.
But you also said your institution has an expiry date. You also said it's for 3 years.
Yeah,
it's a bit like a logic of a grant, right?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I must say, I feel that we rewrote our history looking backwards. I mean, I don't know if, you know, when Sara and Jens founded it, really thought, okay, this is just gonna last 3 years. I feel that after 2 years and with the military coup and everything that happened and the political situation that completely collapsed, it just became clearer and clearer that it just could not continue. And so at 2 years, we started thinking, okay, let's have another year and just stop. It was definitely never thought or meant to last forever. And this is another question. Do institutions need to, you know, exist forever? Can we actually leave space to new ideas and new forms that might be more relevant and more crucial at a certain point? And that's what we were thinking. But also, I mean, maybe something that I just want to highlight to connect to this, you know, issue of the seduction that places of, in this case, revolution actually play, is that there's often a very superficial understanding of what the real context actually is. And so essentially there's a great danger actually in that international attention, in having a huge impact in changing a scene without actually the responsibility of taking care for it for a longer period of time. It's almost like you adopt a baby for 2 years and then you send him back to an orphanage, exactly. So actually you create a situation that is a pure illusion for a few years and then you can just leave as quickly. So for me it was also really, and that really led me to think of like, what type of engagements are we actually producing? You know, what type of engagements are we actually interested in? And this is not just about funders, but for me it's also about museums or institutions, particularly when they start collaborations with smaller precarious beings, like how much, you know, how much do you care actually for the life of other organizations that might also depend from you, but that often are just used and abused on it's like a one-night stand kind of thing. And I feel that this way of operating is really something that needs to change.
But so what's happened in that context when you left Cairo? What is happening with the artists you work with, the local artists, the local scene, you know, how?
Yeah, so it's really sad, actually. I mean, in the sense that the political situation in Cairo is disastrous right now. So basically what happened while we were working is that there is a new law against independent organizations, and basically if you're not a registered independent organizations in Egypt right now, you basically risk lifelong imprisonment. Essentially it means you need to be registered as an NGO in order to receive foreign funding. And imagine they all only live on foreign funding because there is no governmental funding. But if you want to register as an NGO, it takes forever, maybe never, they don't have to respond. And then if you become a registered NGO, they have to check. They need to be in your board and they need to approve every foreign funding that comes in. And this, of course, could take years. And this is, of course, basically how they, you know, censor. So what most independent organizations had always done was to register as limited liability companies in Egypt, so private companies or law firms, and basically as not-for-profits offshore in other countries. Visual arts organizations were mostly, for example, registered as offshores in Sweden. Film, Bahamas. Yeah, not in, funnily enough, it's funny, no? Like this idea of the not-for-profit actually that offshore, and why they have to do it? Because funders cannot give them funds if they're registered as a company. So, for instance, Ford Foundation, there was a paramount funder in the region, in the whole Arab region, and that actually now left the region entirely, which, you know, is worth having another discussion on. needed this not-for-profit registration somewhere else. So imagine the complicated issue of like opening another institution with the little money that you have in Sweden, having money coming to Sweden, and then the money to Sweden being channeled into the... Now, in 2014, the new president, which is Al-Sisi in Egypt, realized that this was happening. So he created a new sort of, or reinforced the previous law asking all organizations to register. All organizations that say performing not-for-profit activities to register, and this basically destroyed the whole scene because people were totally freaking out. I mean, basically, if they would figure out that what you were doing, you would risk lifelong imprisonment, which in Egypt is 25 years of jail. So a lot of organizations closed, people left the country, we also closed, among many others. Now, I mean, I live in Berlin, I work with Savi. I must say a lot of the artists I used to work with moved to Berlin. I must say I still work with a lot of artists that I used to work with at the time. But
one of them is actually a Polish Egyptian
yes,
artist.
Yes, exactly, Yasmina Metwali.
Yeah, do you have maybe an image of her work?
Or no? I don't.
Because you also did a solo show with her.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
I don't know how much she's actually known in Poland. No? She's an amazing artist.
She studied in Poznan.
Yeah. And has been co-founder of this Tahrir cinema collective during the Egyptian Revolution.
Yeah, that also did Tahrir cinema.
It was so interesting because I was also in Cairo with Żmijewski doing the research for Berlin Biennale.
Yeah, I remember.
Looking how artists respond to the situation of urgency and how artistic tools like visual culture can actually contribute to this kind of urgencies. And the Tahrir cinema was an amazing example of how, you know, showing to people like how not to be manipulated by images. You know? And Yasmina was very much at the forefront.
And actually the solo show that we did in Berlin then was a show that very much related to that. I mean, now they opened an archive which is called 858 dot something. Which is basically because what they did was they created a YouTube channel that collected all images of the uprisings that were being made by citizens. Because of course these were all images that the government was not showing, that were not being distributed, etc. So they were reclaiming their own history over one that was just, you know, written top down. And so they collected 858 hours of footage that at the time already were screened online on YouTube. They were just featuring, and then were shown again in Tahrir in an open air cinema. And now the archive is online, and actually all those images can be used by anyone and appropriated and edited. And so, you know, for many people and also for many activists, it's also a moment of, you know, great crisis. I mean, the outcome of those uprisings, I also have difficulties calling it a revolution, are an extremely traumatic moment where,
But this brings me to another question. Because definitely, you know, what you created, you are solidaric probably till today with this artist from Egypt. Not all of them probably moved to Berlin. Some stayed there. Yeah. And I'm wondering, looking at Savi's work, at your work, is it possible to think of curating being driven by solidarity rather than only artistic criteria?
Absolutely. This is such a good point.
Curating to be anti-racist, you know, and how would you, which kind of curating, how do you understand this kind of curating?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I feel that anti-racism is definitely at the core of maybe Savi's even reason for being founded. But I really like
funded so
not
much.
Not funded at all. In fact, for not being. That's the reason for not being funded.
No,
maybe
but a little bit. It's funded a little bit. No.
No. It is. It
Since
is.
Last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I mean, yeah, I guess it's something that goes beyond just, first of all, maybe definitions of universal quality. I mean, there was actually Maria Lind that I think was talking about very interestingly how, you know, determining the value of art is very situational and relational, actually, you know, like it really depends on context, of situation, of moment, of historical period. And so I think that this idea of anti-racism or, you know, solidarity of feminist practices, of forming new alliances has much more value than some, you know, broad normative conception of what artistic quality may or may not be. And I think also in dangerous times as the ones that are, you know, prefiguring themselves more and more in Europe, this is something we definitely need to deeply think about. And again, how can we think also of long-term engagements instead of just, you know, short-term again, nightstands, you know, like what does it mean to care for real, for artists? Not about only maybe one of their genius works, but how do you care for artistic practices more profoundly? And what is your role in that as an institution, which I feel we do already by working many times also with the same artists. I mean, we rarely, we kind of build long-lasting relationships, which may not be just, you know, several solo shows, but different types of relations, of dialogue, of conversation, of contributions in different forms, of support also when they work abroad. This is actually something we were doing a lot when we were in Cairo, because we knew that we were constantly invited to do things abroad. And so one of the things we would do is take those opportunities to actually produce works of artists that wouldn't have the funds to produce otherwise. And in some cases, we even produced journals or magazines that were actually, you know, in Arabic, basically, and were then distributed in Cairo, but produced in the context of some, you know, other festival, most probably in Europe. And so I think in that case, it becomes also really a way of thinking, how can you use current yeah, I mean, ongoing kind of platforms and sort of networking, and like once you understand, you know, the reasons behind invitations, I feel you can also manipulate them back and kind of shape them in the way you feel is also just more fruitful and useful. I want to think also sometimes as functionality and usefulness for the local scene.
But do you need an institution for this, or can you also do it as an independent curator? Because you are both in some sense. You belong to some institutions, you are also independent. Do you think it needs to be embedded with the institution, or is it just your own agenda that kind of cuts through structural racism or this
No, I think, of course, it can definitely run through very different layers and levels. I must say, I haven't been independent for I mean, it's true that I curate also independent projects, but I've always been working, I realize, with organizations for very long. So I always have a kind of organizational affiliation, which I think also is a, it's also a kind of form of protection on the one, in some sense, because the organization in which I work also becomes a form of alliance and a body that transcends myself. You feel less alone, you have people that you collaborate with. So it's also an interesting, becomes a union in some sense, especially, I mean, when it's organizations like this, there are barely institutions, so they're not, you know, it's not like working in an institution from a salary perspective, but it is in terms of having a team or a group of people that stand behind also similar values and with whom you actually share, at times, very radical or dangerous choices also you're making, which I feel you're much more vulnerable probably alone. And I had 1 year where I was alone between Cairo and Berlin with a child and etc. And I've never felt so vulnerable before. So in a way also starting then to work at Savi for me became an incredible environment of protection somehow, a safe space.
That's also interesting, like art center as in America they use this term sanctuary.
Oh, really?
So art space as a sanctuary. Laura Rajkowicz, who was actually fired from Queen's Museum, she's using this sanctuary. In Polish it's like sanctuarium, but it's more than this. It's like a safe space, safe zone, so to say. But actually, to also speak about things that didn't work. About 1 year ago or more, you were also appointed as one of the curators of Extra City, a place in Antwerp, right? Together with Iliana Fokidis. And I remember you implemented also quite radical politics of dealing with Belgium, colonial past, and the monuments that are in the city center. Only 1 year after, we recently, last week, read you know, your statement of resigning, your resignation, together with Joanna. Can you talk a little bit about this and what actually, what can we learn from curating and pitfalls of it in that case?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy to talk about it because it's a very recent bound, but I guess that and that's maybe also where the title comes in, neutrality is complicity. I feel if we see things and we understand that certain things, you know, clash with our ethical values, it's not enough to just stand and, you know, say, oh, this is, you know, not my direct responsibility, hence I should not be involved, you know? If you think even into the hierarchy of an institution, what the director decides, what the curator's role is, what everybody's role is. And I feel that in this case, it wasn't necessarily, you know, about the direct exhibitions we were curating, but simply the way the institution is essentially being run and directed, that I have fundamental disagreements with. And when you realize that there's no possibility of dialogue because, in fact, structures are much more hierarchical than they're claimed to be, right? Because I think there's always a big difference between what we say we are and what we say we do and what we really do. And this is also where I always, and I feel that's just a growing frustration, or I don't know, to put it more positively, a strive to try to be coherent between what we claim on stage and what we actually do in the backstage, how the infrastructure is run in the first place. Like, are we actually, because that's, I feel, where it's much more difficult to actually really really perform those values, because that's actually where you have something to lose, that can be, from economic privilege and your own salaries, for example, when there's budget cuts, who are they applied to, if there's new occasions, new people, new voices, new faces, new interesting curatorial practices, like, are we able to challenge our own positions and make space for others? If we see that there are new organizations or institutions that are doing brilliant work, are we able to challenge ourselves and maybe invite them not just to, perform as lot, but even maybe to, I don't know, adopt them for a longer time by sharing some of our budget with them because we feel or believe that's important or relevant. Like, I'm really thinking, how can we think beyond just the needs of the individual and think in a kind of broader terms, in terms of community, which I think is very difficult. Anyway, to go back to Antwerp, I think these are some of the distribution of funds, actually, for me, was one of the core reasons even behind my resignation. Like, the conditions in which the artists and the artistic, hence also curatorial bodies are supposed to be working versus the whole management of the institution is so completely unbalanced that I just could not accept to work myself and ask artists to work as well in conditions that I feel are essentially extremely unjust. And also I feel that it's also this neoliberalization of institutions where, directors are becoming managers, often, in this case, for example, this was an institution that was basically outsourcing all of its artistic content. So basically, it's a moment in which you think the institution doesn't even really need any producer of content anymore. That can be outsourced just by, everybody being constantly only a freelance. And so people on a salary in the institution are only directors, press office, production, etc. And I feel it's almost like a restaurant without a chef. It's like the core of the institution should be the artistic program. So how do we bring that balance back? And I feel I'm too privileged in many ways, including at my stage of my professional career at this point. I can't just stay and look, even though, I'm not, even though this would not be my direct responsibility, because distribution of funds is not my direct responsibility. But I feel I have a say on it, and so what do you actually do when you feel that disagreements are so profound?
Well, you address them, make them transparent, what you did. I guess it's one of the steps. But I find it so interesting to diagnose this discrepancy between curatorial statements or mission statements of institutions and sometimes what is happening on the ground, or like outreaching, diversing, and and you have been also looking at, for example, I think in London, at the salary of a director and an intern. Did you research a little bit of this economical condition?
I'm looking since a while into the economic conditions. I mean, this was actually already in Beirut. The program, the Imaginary School program that we did was actually looking very much into the economic conditions that defined organization. In that case, it was also really looking into why certain funding comes and with what agenda. At the end of the day, how often do we make decisions on, say, because we know that it will be funded by someone. Now, when most of the funding comes from foreign bodies, what happens to that cultural scene? And also because in these situations, often it's foreign bodies that have an imagination of what might be relevant there. So it's actually a completely schizophrenic type of relationship where you end up doing locally what people sitting in Paris are thinking you should be doing. And then that would translate back also into the economy of the entire context of the organization. I mean, London is just one of the most extreme examples, you know, and Tate Modern being one of them, you know, where the discrepancy between an assistant curator's salary and one of the, I don't know, waiters in the restaurant is gigantic. Like, assistant curators cannot actually afford to work there unless essentially they have a background, which is usually family background, that can afford to support their work, which is the complete paradox also in internships, etc., which is basically we need to be able to afford to work. And this, again, creates a huge division, because it becomes really a huge issue of access. Who has access to the art world at the end? And actually in the study that I was also looking into, which was really a study into who are the producers and who are the consumers of art in England, in the UK, what came out is basically that it's an extremely homogeneous crowd that is absolutely not representative of the social, of the wider society, because it's extremely patriarchal still, it's extremely white, it's extremely monocultural, it's extremely classist, it's essentially predominantly middle and high class that is part of it. So you have this small sect that, that however has huge societal claims about changing the world, you know, ending war and bringing peace around the globe, that actually is just a few people. And actually these people are often also the same consumers. So actually producers and consumers are almost the same people. So, you know, it's an obvious gigantic discrepancy, and if we're not willing to address this more honestly, unfortunately, we're not going to get far, and we will keep sitting from, you know, in our rooms, looking from the window what's actually happening outside, having an opinion on it, but actually keeping it in that room. So, yeah. So I think this is a huge problem. Yeah.
Maybe it's a good moment to open up and ask if you have any comment or a question. Sure. You can ask po polsku też oczywiście.
So yeah, thank you for this very deep insight into your curatorial practice and thinking, and for this very interesting conversation. My question would be about one project I think you haven't mentioned as far, the one that is critically approaching Las Documenta in Athens. If you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah. It's funny, because in principle it wasn't really directly addressing Documenta. However, I feel this is really how it's been perceived. So it's early 2015. I'm basically called up by this curator, Iliana Fokianaki, who had heard about the imaginary school program in Cairo. And was extremely excited about it, because she felt that the situation in Cairo had a lot of parallels with Athens at that point, because also in that case it was the aftermath of the crisis, and all on the sudden, you know, after the Varoufakis, everybody, you know, from the international art world suddenly discovered that actually Athens existed on the art map, and it had even some potential to be interesting, you know, and everybody was coming and going and da-da-da. I think at that point maybe Documenta was not even, it wasn't official yet that Documenta was happening in Athens, or maybe not totally, or not the scale. And so she was like, I really want to do something with the imaginary school program in Athens, because I want to think about how to resist the objectification, ossification, and exoticization that the place risks to fall in, this sort of trap that you risk to fall into in this moment of hyper visibility that you have from day to night. So you know, I started traveling to Athens a lot, and what we realized also, there were deep differences, you know, such as the legal framework, which is an entirely different story between Cairo and Athens, but there were a lot of very similar economic aspects, such as the independent scene. I mean, in Athens, just as in Cairo, you have either museums that are run or half run by government, and otherwise it's all small-scale institutions, basically run voluntarily with maybe little grants here and there by private foundations that in this case are mostly Greek, but still it's just like little private scale, and you have absolutely no mid-scale institutions. So it's also this moment of this, it's like this apocalyptic kind of future of Europe in which, you know, there is no welfare state anymore, that little bits and pieces that are for governmental institutions, it will probably be soon bought by privates because they will be privatized too, or volunteers. And so what we decided to do in the end was trying to somehow emphasize and engage with the reality of what Athens actually was, beyond romanticizing it, in a sense. You know, I was actually really trying to look into what organizations are working, under which conditions, are they really so imaginative or not? And in fact, mostly they were all working in exactly the same way. So also, we were really trying to draw from what the cultural landscape was offering particularly, and of course, in a sense, also maybe trying to witness with a critical consciousness what was also happening in the scene throughout this year in which, you know, Documenta happened. But it wasn't just Documenta. I mean, a lot of people, as also Iliana also wants to emphasize always, a lot of important people, you know, from Slavoj Žižek to Alain Badiou, were already interested in Athens, you know, before. What really created the seduction was the Varoufakis' heroic move against Europe at the end of the day. And the also kind of depressing parts, which in a sense also made me think of Egypt, is that it went really bad. I mean, that heroic move had a terrible outcome, and that actually the moment in which all of this art world, you know, had their cameras pointed at Athens, the majority of the population was already extremely depressed and extremely cynical about the political future. I mean, the sort of moment of hope had already gone, and so was actually Egypt. If I go back to this conference, you know, in Qatar in 2014, I mean, we're basically at a conference, you know, in Qatar with all museum directors from all over the world, and constantly Tahrir Square is, you know, which was, you know, the square that became this sort of symbol of the Egyptian revolution, was quoted as this place of emancipation, freedom, upheaval, resistance, blah, blah. And actually, exactly in the same moment, demonstrations are not even legal anymore. 10 people together cannot even gather, you know, like the entire independent institutional landscape is being destroyed. And so you have this like...
Plus you are sitting in Qatar.
And you're sitting in Qatar, out of all places. Yeah, and so you have this like huge discrepancy from like, you're actually attached to an image that is not there, that has been a complete... And it had a lot of similarities to Athens at that point, and to a lot of people that we were working with that were saying this is the most boring period in Athens ever, because, you know, after the big also demonstrations, etc., the outcome is that there is no political future and we will succumb. Now, I don't want to be so pessimistic, but unfortunately, this is really what ultimately, you know, happened. And yeah, so why we also founded Future Climates is thinking, okay, maybe we should actually create a platform that continues to grow. So not just, you know, do 8 months in Egypt and then these 3 months in Athens, but like how can we keep growing also from, you know, contexts and organizational structures or modes of working that we can draw inspiration from, but also can think with, to find essentially new forms of sustainability that should try to think beyond the dependency on essentially grants. So now we're actually in a phase in which we're looking a lot into financial structures and derivatives, but this is another complicated complicated sphere. But this is actually the projects that came out of Athens have to do with new forms of self-sustainability based on the use of new coins, for example, and literally funds that are invested in finance. Yeah.
guess, you know, when you speak about the end of the career moment, so to say, I guess we don't want it to end because we want the energy that was there somehow to survive. And I try to look at those kind of moments, you know, of resistance more optimistically, because looking back at history, for example, how, you know, voting rights for women came about. They didn't come about through one demonstration. There was one demonstration which was suppressed, and 5 years later there was another group of women or people who mobilized, you know, and it's kind of a oppositional...
I totally agree, but the thing is that you have to then look at the reality, because I feel otherwise you're just stopping at an image that has passed, hence whatever you can do with it is actually dysfunctional because there's another situation. And it's almost like when you marry, and it's this exciting event of the marriage and da-da-da, but actually being married, that's what comes after the act of marrying. And that's where you really have to, and it's much less heroic, much dirtier, you know, there's a lot of more compromises, but I feel that it's that less unspectacular, darker period that comes after, you know, the kind of eventful moment that I think we should focus on and work with and struggle with and support, and that is off camera, you know. That's, I guess, what I mean also with this like very short-term engagements. This is the one-night stand, but it's the relationship that is difficult, and I feel that only that relationship will then really create you know, a space of support, like in the thing in Qatar, like on in a sudden, you know, oh, then come and talk to be part of a panel discussion, as if that would have any possible use, you know, like how do you actually really create maybe a solidarity support system, for example, for vulnerable subjects. Actually, that's something that I'm thinking a lot about, is like creating a social justice fund for vulnerable workers that are really maybe also without institutions or with vulnerable institutions. Yeah, art workers, which is a new word that I use to unify various, because there's a lot of also individualism in this field, right? And so how do we form alliances that can really act as a body that can resist something? Because otherwise, I mean, you're just...
Last chance. Oh, there is one question over there.
I think what you were saying about the difference between the politics in a program and the politics of the institution and how it functions, I think is, you know, a really big problem across all different institutions. And I'd just be interested to hear a bit more about how you think that can change, you know, kind of real longer term way, or how it should change. And I mean big and small institutions. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's hard to talk in, you know, universal terms. I feel every organization and every institution will have its own set of issues to deal with. But I really strive for transparency as a first thing. Challenging ourselves structurally. So also when we talk about diversity, etc., it's not just about what, you know, it's not just about making one show that looks at Africa or Japan, or it's about being more inclusive in general in the way we think about artistic practices, you know, in the parameters, as we were talking about qualities, we use actually even to define and determine what has value and what is not, which is shifting, you know, if you think also how much, for how long also women and feminist women practices were. So how can you be inclusive, more broadly, instead of just, you know, these short categories and short inclusions, but also structurally, you know, how do we structurally diversify our institutions? And that has to do with gender, geographical provenance, but also with class, meaning also what kind of possibilities we actually can give that would allow, you know, people who do not have other sources of income, for example, to even participate. So I actually, and that's where maybe I'm really inspired also by various feminist theories. I really believe in also small acts of care, you know, beyond grand definition, grand claims, but really on the micro scale, how do we exist in the world? I mean, that, you know, goes from also really the space of the home, the domestic, how we interact with others, and that also relates then to how we organize within our own institutions. Like, how do we actually produce a change that maybe you will not even be able to brand or sell because this is not going to be featured in a press release, you know, but it's still a change. And I mean, in a space like Beirut, for example, what we really tried to think curatorially about is that every aspect of the institution was thought about, actually in that case, even as an artwork somehow, or as something that we would commit to in dialogue with artists. So for example, our own legal registration even was actually a piece by Goldin and Sennebi. So Beirut never existed as an institution, but existed as a Goldin and Sennebi limited liability company. And the reason why we did this with Goldin and Sennebi is because we wanted to have the conversation about the difficulties of funding and the fact that you needed to exist as a limited liability with all the funders we needed to deal with the banks we opened a bank account with. So it's almost with the artists that we were working with, because every time they had to sign a contract, they saw this limited liability company Goldin and Sennebi thing. And then always a conversation happens because you need to explain why the hell you're called like that. And so how can you think about audience also in a broader term, which is not literally who walks into the exhibition, but every person that in a sense you have to interact with. And so how can you find tricks that allow you to essentially also bring awareness, right, of various problems on a broader scale, and problems that have to do with infrastructure. I mean, there's something that Suhail Malik talks about that I really, really agree with, which is that, you know, maybe the only way to be truly political is by engaging with the conditions of productions that make things possible, and not hiding them, but actually making them part of what we say, of how we say it, of what we present.
Yeah, but he also actually diagnoses very well this, you know, in art world, the predominance of question marks and not affiliating with certain social cause or movements. And that's our kind of a problem. And this brings me also to some kind of thought that, especially in places like homogenic Poland and right-wing Poland, like Italy can be compared.
Italy's terrible right now.
Our times, maybe actually art institutions, the more, you know, the more homogenic, the more national it gets on one side, the more intersectional, the more multicultural, the more feminist the art institutions could be. You know, it could be kind of a form of an opposition almost, right? Of being really structurally responding to the other side, dominated by this white man, you know.
Yeah, because also they use representation, right? I mean, there's so much false information and false representation there. I mean, if I talk about the Italian context at least, like, it's incredible. I was just in Florence the other day, and it's all about, from TV to bar discussions to newspapers, it's all about Italian grandiosity, you know, like how the cultural heritage of Italy is the best in the world, how our production is the best of the world, and everything we do is like amazing.
About the kitchen, it's true.
And basically, the problem that is emphasized everywhere is how global orders and foreigners that go from European Union members to the rest of the world are challenging our century-old life and traditions. And cultural institutions need to challenge this bullshit. It's like really, literally. We need to programmatically try to present different images and different stories that are, Kojo Eshen was talking, the malevolent and, was it programmatic? Act of agnosia. And with agnosia, he was talking about the malevolent act of erasure. That's the thing. It's not about telling a partial truth. It's erasing a big part of what has happened, of the representation of sound. And we're just surrounded by erasure. So how do we hold on to, you know, this is a big role that we could represent in, like, not letting so much just be gone and erased. Malevolent and rigorous. That's what he was saying. Malevolent and rigorous act of erasure, which paradoxically, though, often I find that smaller institutions can do more, also because they have less costs, need to take less compromises, have you know, different relationships to public institutions. So it's a very complicated dynamic. That's why I think we need more alliances, actually, between institutions of different sizes and scales, because depending on your scale, there's certain things that you will be able to say and certain things that you will not be able to say. So how do we, you know, acknowledge the importance and the paramount importance of both, of different types of spaces, I guess.
I guess this is something which we carry with us from this fantastic talk. So, and I actually have just as a footnote, last question. So is it true that you also run a restaurant in Florence?
Yes.
To diversify your income from that?
Absolutely. Actually, this is post-Cairo. I was extremely depressed, but it's my brother. Yeah. My brother opened, and he needed people who would invest, and he just took a lot of friends with little money. So now we're a limited liability company of a lot of people, but with small shares, and we have 3 restaurants already.
Okay, good. So with these words, Antonia, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been really inspiring listening to you, and thank you for attending.
Bardzo dziękuję też Państwu jako tej
Thank you very much. Thank you for staying here until the end. I'd like to remind you, some of you already know, that our next guest in this series of talks will be the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art from Barcelona. It will be the 8th of December. 8th of
wtorek. Jeżeli będziecie chcieli się intelektualnie trochę ożywić po
8th of January, after Christmas. So you are warmly invited to this interesting meeting.
Much for the whole conversation, and yeah, thank you for this evening. Dziękuję za przybycie do nas.